All right, part two of our Introduction to Tragedy lecture. Let's go through this list briefly just to highlight some important features of ancient tragedy and really ancient theater in general. There were only two genres available, that was the tragedy or the comedy. First of all, it was all done in mask, and so you did a lot of body acting and voice acting, but your facial features weren't going to matter too much. There would be no violence on stage. This is something that Shakespeare seems to have adopted as well. He largely makes his violence happen off stage or minimizes it in some realm, which you can imagine makes Mr. Rich kind of happy. They were all male, as they were in Shakespeare's days, so regardless of what part was being played, it was going to be a male actor. Now, they were also musicals, so we may have mentioned this to some of the classes yesterday, but some of you missed it. Think, it was religious in nature, but also musical, also celebratory. The main musical elements, as far as I can tell, would have consisted in the chorus parts. So last night you read this really long description of some aspects of the Trojan War, especially aspects preceding the actual war. And that whole part would have been sung. And, what did it sound like? Your guess is as good as mine. But the point is, it was all going to be in song. Now, when Agamemnon shows up and speaks to Clytemnestra, or et cetera, the herald and all those things, those parts were probably spoken. The tragedies we read were both trilogies and part of a competition. So I think it's a good, if you can think of like Sundance Film Festival or Cannes, everybody shows up, they show all their films, and then the judges vote on the best ones. And basically same thing was going on at the Dionysia in Athens every year. Only difference was that it was all being done on stage. So the competitions, were very prestigious, and there's lots of records. There's even some really interesting archaeological records. And prizes often were, in fact, tripods. Okay, so it seems to be a common item, commonly coveted item in the ancient world. And the plays would have been done in installments of 3. So what we're reading is part 1 of a lot of these plays. Okay, so the Agamemnon, the Oedipus play, and Medea. They seem all to be the first installments. Now, what happened in the second and third installments? Well, we have one of these still in existence, and it is called the Oresteia. Now, the Oresteia is based on the name Orestes, who is the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. Okay, now he's not going to play a big part in the play we read, but in the next one he plays a huge part, and in the third one he plays a big part as well. So the play, the series gets its name from him. As to why the second and third parts don't tend to survive, it's a good question. I don't know that anyone can answer with certainty. I can say this, that even the Oresteia, which I have a lot of respect for, it does seem to have a deus ex machina kind of ending. That is, literally, a goddess shows up. Well, no, it's a god. It's Apollo. He shows up at the end, and sort of like it ends with this big trial, and you got this jury, and they're dead split down the middle, and then Apollo shows up and says, "Well, I cast my vote this way," and so it ends up that Orestes is acquitted and he walks free, and yay, everybody's happy, and you're like, "Is that it? Is that how this ends?" And so, I think my guess is that those third installments really just didn't have a lot of appeal because of that Deus Ex Machina element, but that's a guess. Well, what I do know is that the ones that survive look a lot like the ones that Shakespeare ended up writing later. They have the nosedive from, prosperity to misfortune, no real recovery, no real solution in the end. And frankly, that's, I think that's come to be what we associate with tragedy, and there is a kind of value in it. So let's talk a little bit about that. The great philosopher Aristotle has some things to say about what makes a tragic plot and why people go see it. It's not just to be sad. There's a certain benefit to this plot that Aristotle thinks he's located, and we'll have to see if you agree by the time we've read a couple of these. First of all, about the tragic plot. The tragic plot, pretty simple. It's sort of like going from a place of happiness and prosperity down to a place of misery, usually death. And it's just so over the course of 24 hours, usually, you see someone meet their demise. Now, in the Agamemnon, frankly, the tragic character Agamemnon doesn't really seem to be central to the whole plot. So it's very interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean that the tragedy itself is the centerpiece of the drama, okay? Because Clytemnestra clearly plays a more prominent, more interesting role in the play we're reading. But nonetheless, that's the plot. It's the plot of human downfall. And normally it's the person of some measurably high standard, somebody who's enjoying life. I've got Pharrell up there for just kicks and grins, but you get the idea. When Agamemnon is going to come home in this play, he's coming home from victory at the Trojan War. He's feeling pretty good, and so when he, meets his demise, it's sort of a strong contrast, and that's normally the way these things are. So you get a character like Hamlet, who's the Prince of Denmark, whose things are going well. Yes, his father dies, but he's a person of great position and relative sanity. By the end of the play, he seems to have lost his mind and everything's fallen apart. So that's the kind of the way it happens again and again. Romeo and Juliet, over and over again. It's people who are in relatively stable positions of life, and they just go in this downward spiral. Why do we do that? Well, Aristotle said that the reason we like these plots is because they provide catharsis. Now, catharsis means cleansing. It's a Greek term. And the idea here is that you've got this pent up fear and pity in your psyche. And when you see the downfall of this character possibly through empathetic transference, you're able to kind of spend that pity and fear in behalf of the character as they fall. And it's not just that, it could be, some people associate it with like a roller coaster ride or going through a haunted house, and you, on the other end of it, you're shook up a little bit, but you're kind of glad to be alive. And you might even have like a new kind of perspective on life, so it's like, whew, I made it, I'm here. And, everything's more vibrant, and you're like, man, I appreciate life so much more because I survived that roller coaster. I survived this haunted house. And that might be an element to it, but I think there's a deeper element. And something like wisdom is all I can say, is that, in the part you read last night, the chorus actually says, mankind must suffer to be wise, right? The idea is that we never take wisdom willingly. It has to be foisted upon us through suffering. And so in a sense, the experience of the tragedy is a sort of vicarious experience of suffering through which we gain wisdom. So again, it's not just us, watching somebody suffer and thinking, "Oh gosh, that's so terrible," kind of gawking at their misfortune. It's more that we're experiencing with them, and we're falling with the characters, or suffering with the characters, and seeing how it all works out, and through that gaining wisdom. And that's so as I mentioned earlier, the violence is not a big part of the play, right? Because that's not what these playwrights are trying to get across. They're not here to give you a spectacle of humans battling it out, okay? They don't even go as far as Homer would in that regard. He tried to provide kind of authentic realism for the war scenes. The playwrights generally are not interested in that. The tragedians, these playwrights, they are trying to get you into the soul of human experience. And if they're successful, you suffer with, you struggle with the characters you watch, and in the end, hopefully you gain a kind of wisdom through suffering with them and vicariously through them. Well, if you're going to do that, that means that these characters have to have certain qualities, right? If you're going to connect with them and feel some sense of pity for their downfall, if you're going to feel any kind of fear, perhaps, that like, oh, this could happen to me, something kind of thing, then there's only certain kind of characters that are going to match that description. So first of all, nobody cares if a villain, a terrible, rotten person all the way down, ends up getting what they justly deserve. we all just applaud and go on about our day. We think, yay, that's what they desire. That's what they deserve. Now, earlier we kind of talked about the problems of that from a Christian angle, but your general audience is going to celebrate the downfall of a true and thoroughly bad character. Similarly, if we see a saint, somebody who's just like perfectly good, suffering and for no good reason, well, that's horror. I mean, that's like shock. We don't like that. I mean, well, we do. We watch it all the time, in horror movies, but that's what horror movies are doing, right? I mean, it's all about the shock. It's all about the scare. And the revulsion, and we kind of get tickled by it. And so we think, oh gosh, that was terribly scary, but at the same time, it was kind of fun. But that's not wisdom. That's not giving us wisdom. There's a pleasure to that, and I'm not going to deny it, but it's not wisdom. What we're looking for is above average Joes, like, people that are pretty good, have their faults in the past, make some bad mistakes, but end up suffering something that we don't think they necessarily deserved because of what they did. And so at least it should be an open question. When that kind of character meets with tragic suffering, then we start to be involved on a new level. It's not just a travesty. It's not just justice in action. It's real human life, and we're having to wrestle with it. If you want to, think about Job. Think about what happens to that guy. Why would a book like that ever get written? Well, it's because it asks some really pertinent questions that all of us are going to have to face in our life. And that's what tragedy does. It forces you up against some of the hardest questions of life. Questions about justice, questions about rationality, questions about responsibility. And so we're going to see that unfold in, I hope, 3 different tragedies over the course of this semester.